welcome to the debate. Imagine you are, say, 3 months behind on your rent,
Oof. Yeah, stressful.
right? You're completely exhausted, and you finally sit down with a career professional, and you say, please, just put whatever keywords the algorithm wants on my resume so I can get a job.
Just get me past the filter.
Exactly. And the professional looks at you and says, no, I have to decline this work.
It sounds incredibly cold. And yet this isn't some abstract hypothetical. It is the exact mandate we are looking at today.
Right. Today, we are digging deep into the specific rule book that governs certified living professional record advisors, or, CLPRAs.
The LPR Academy curriculum.
Specifically, Module 9, we're looking squarely at the rigid practice boundaries they establish for these professionals.
Which is a framework literally called pause, refer, or decline. And it's a very strict protocol that dictates exactly when an advisor must hit the brakes and just refuse to move forward with a client.
Yeah. And the core tension we're debating today revolves around that very rigidity. Like, does the strict mandate to decline so-called unsafe work, and actually framing that refusal not as a failure but as professional practice, does that ultimately protect the client's underlying truth, or
does it prioritize the purity of the LPR method over the desperate, very human realities of job seekers who are just trying to survive a completely broken labor market?
Precisely. And I'll state my position right off the bat here. I argue that strict adherence to the pause, refer, or decline framework is the absolute ethical bedrock of the LPR method. An advisor's restraint is a vital protective mechanism. It's frankly the only thing that separates a client's dignity and their authentic professional history from just the mere manufacture of proof and market hype.
And as you might guess, I take the opposing view.
Naturally.
Look, while client safety is obviously paramount, treating these specific boundaries as inflexible dogma risks abandoning clients in their absolute most vulnerable moments. I argue that when you apply this intense rigidity to people facing extreme financial and emotional pressure, you are effectively stranding them. You're leaving them to fend for themselves under the guise of maintaining some kind of methodological purity.
Okay, well, let's define how this methodology actually works on the ground first, so we aren't just talking in abstractions.
Fair enough.
The primary duty of a CLPRA is what the Academy calls source-to-surface governance. To put that simply, the source is the raw, private evidence of your career, right?
Right. Your actual emails, project files, performance reviews.
Exactly. And the surface is what the public actually sees. Your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your portfolio. The cardinal rule of the LPR method is that the client owns that source layer. And to protect it, the advisor has to be incredibly strict.
Right. But what does strict actually mean in practice? Because that's where things get messy.
It means knowing your boundaries. The text is very clear on the specific triggers. It says you must decline when the client insists on false claims, unsafe evidence use, outcome guarantees, certification misrepresentation, or, work outside scope that cannot be safely reframed.
Yes, and
Wait, just to finish the thought. This refusal isn't a lack of empathy. It is the physical mechanism that prevents this highly specialized advising from drifting into generic career coaching, or worse, drifting into a surveillance operation where we're just harvesting a worker's data to satisfy a hiring algorithm. Without this hard boundary, the entire method just collapses.
sure, in a vacuum, that logic holds up perfectly. But look at the actual reality of the modern labor market. Even the source text acknowledges this.
It does.
It points out that clients don't arrive in a state of calm, rational calculation. They arrive burdened with shame, anger, complete exhaustion, and severe financial pressure.
I'm not denying that.
But the moment a terrified client says, "I just need a job, make me sound better," the rigid mandate to immediately pause or decline the work creates this massive clinical distance. You are throwing up a bureaucratic wall right when a human being is in crisis. So yes, this rigidity absolutely protects the advisor's professional scope, but it fundamentally fails to meet the human urgency of the room.
You can't just wave away the rules because the client is stressed. The urgency is exactly why the rules exist in the first place.
I'm not waving them away, I'm saying
The threat of what the Academy calls anti-drift is central here. The LPR method requires the advisor to resist drift at all costs. We cannot drift from evidence into hype, we cannot drift from privacy into exposure, and perhaps most controversially, we cannot drift from advising into therapy.
Let's talk about that last one, because this is where the doctrine really starts to show its flaws.
Wait, let me just lay out the actual mechanics of the framework first so everyone understands what we're actually talking about.
Go ahead.
Advisor judgment fundamentally includes knowing when not to proceed. There are 3 levers. First, you pause when privacy, consent, legality, AI use, or the status of the evidence is unclear.
Right.
Second, you refer when the client needs legal, financial, therapeutic, immigration, HR, tax, or specialized professional support.
Okay.
And third, as I mentioned, you decline when the client insists on false claims or outcome guarantees. The text is definitive on this. Declining unsafe work is not failure. It is professional practice.
Okay, but applying those 3 levers as blunt instruments is exactly where the damage happens. Let's look closely at that drift from advising into therapy rule. The curriculum gives us a very profound concept called silence fatigue.
Yes, it's a great concept.
It is. When you apply for jobs today, the automated hiring system has no face. You throw your data into a void, and you hear absolutely nothing back. That silence causes deep fatigue. It feels incredibly personal.
It is deeply painful. The text explicitly acknowledges that.
Yes, it acknowledges it, but look at how it tells the advisor to react. When a client exhibits transition shock or a loss of identity because of this brutal silence, the strict interpretation of your framework says, this is bordering on therapy. I am not a therapist. I must pause and refer out.
Because they aren't a therapist.
I argue that instantly trying to refer a client to a therapist just because they're having a completely normal human reaction to a broken system is an intellectual cop-out. It abandons the client right when they need someone to help them navigate the exact system that is causing their pain.
I have to stop you there because framing it as an intellectual cop-out completely ignores the very real danger of operating outside your professional license.
It's not about playing doctor. It's about
A CLPRA is trained in the data governance of professional records. They are not licensed mental health professionals. Let's think about this mechanistically. It's like an architect building a bridge on a swamp.
Okay, I love a good swamp analogy.
If a client comes to you panicked because they need to cross the swamp today, you can't just paint a piece of plywood, lay it on the mud, and tell them it's a bridge just to make them feel better in the moment.
But they need to cross the swamp.
But if you don't drive the pilings down to the bedrock, if you don't connect their claims to solid, verifiable source evidence, the bridge collapses the second a background check applies weight to it.
That's a huge leap.
In the LPR space, creating a surface claim without underlying source evidence, just because a client is experiencing transition shock, is the equivalent of malpractice. It feels good today, and it gets them fired for misrepresentation tomorrow. The advisor's job is to offer steadiness, not psychological intervention.
But
The curriculum gives a very specific, aligned response for this. We acknowledge the silence is painful, but we instruct the client not to treat it as a verdict on their value. Then we pivot back to examining the evidence. We maintain the boundary.
And by immediately pivoting back to, let's look at the evidence, you completely invalidate the emotional reality of the room. You are intellectualizing their suffering. And honestly, this plays out disastrously in the practical workflow.
How so?
It brings us to the tension between orientation and optimization. The source material outlines a scenario where a desperate client literally says, "I do not care about a record, I just need a job." They are in a state of sheer panic. And the method's strict mandate is that the advisor must orient before optimizing.
Absolutely. You cannot optimize a professional profile if you haven't oriented yourself to the actual facts of their career.
But do you realize what orientation physically entails in this method? It forces a terrified, financially strapped client to sit through an evidence inventory. They have to reconstruct the context of their past jobs. They have to do privacy labeling. They have to map their claims to the source material.
Yes, that is the work.
All of this before the advisor will even touch their resume or their LinkedIn profile. I argue this is heavily bureaucratic. It completely ignores the reality of someone who might miss their rent payment next week. When you force a client in panic to sit through an academic exercise about claim maturity before you help them generate a workable resume, you are prioritizing the rules of the LPR method over their immediate survival.
Okay, if we skip orientation and just start optimizing an unsupported claim, what exactly are we doing?
Helping them survive.
No, we are polishing a lie. We are setting the client up for institutional failure.
Not necessarily. You're giving them a tool to get through an automated door. If they are drowning in the swamp, they just need a log to grab onto right now. They don't care about your fully permitted, perfectly governed suspension bridge.
But the log won't hold their weight. Let's walk through the actual mechanics of this. If a client wants to claim director of marketing on their surface rendering because they know the algorithm is filtering for it.
Which it is.
Right, but we haven't done the orientation to figure out if their source evidence actually supports formal department leadership versus just, say, informal influence. Then we are fabricating a record.
The curriculum gives us a very specific practice rhythm for a reason. You orient, then you scope, then capture, classify, map claims, apply privacy, translate to the market lane, and finally render the surface.
That is a luxury timeline for people who aren't desperate.
But the text explicitly addresses urgency. It states clearly that client urgency may shrink the size of the first scope, but it must not remove the governance.
Shrinking the size doesn't fix the bottleneck. So yes, if they are panicked, we don't build a comprehensive 10-year career record. We focus on the smallest useful record entry first to support an immediate resume update. But we absolutely cannot abandon the orientation phase. Skipping it exposes them to failing a background check at the offer stage, which completely compounds their crisis.
Shrinking the scope is fine in theory, but when you are dealing with applicant tracking systems, automated filtering systems that are essentially low-feedback black boxes, the client doesn't need the smallest useful record entry, they need aggressive market translation.
Within the bounds of truth.
If the advisor is so constrained by governance that they refuse to optimize a resume for the exact keywords the system is indiscriminately demanding, the client will never even get to the human interview where they can explain their nuance.
And if they use keywords they can't prove, they are lying to a machine.
The LPR method treats the hiring market like a rational, truth-seeking ecosystem. It is not. It is an adversarial, risk-averse sorting machine. By refusing to optimize blindly to beat the filter, you are sending a client into a knife fight with a beautifully governed, highly private clipboard.
That is a fantastic image, really, but it totally misrepresents what the advisor is doing. We aren't sending them in with a clipboard. We are sending them in with a shield of defensible truth.
A shield doesn't get you past the ATS.
If the automated system demands a keyword that the client's evidence simply does not support, putting that keyword on the resume is a false claim, period. The advisor's professional power comes from restraint just as much as skill, which, frankly, brings us to the ultimate philosophical boundary in Module 9.
Yes. The absolute refusal to guarantee employment outcomes.
Yes, the doctrine is explicit on this. Under the decline lever, an advisor must decline work if the client insists on outcome guarantees. You must never promise jobs, interviews, offers, or ATS success. The LPR method improves your source discipline, your clarity, and your privacy. It does not and cannot control the labor market. Promising an outcome is a violation of the rules.
And this is exactly where the doctrine starts to look incredibly suspicious to me. It stops feeling like a moral stance and starts feeling like a highly engineered corporate liability shield.
Oh, come on. How so? Protecting a client from false help is a liability shield?
Let's look at the language. The text leans heavily on this idea that human dignity comes before the record. It instructs the advisor to look at a broken, rejected client and say things like, "Your dignity does not depend on this record."
I think that is a vital statement to make to someone who has been beaten down by endless automated rejections.
It sounds profound in a sterile classroom setting, but imagine actually saying that to a 55-year-old unemployed worker facing severe algorithmic age bias, or someone geographically limited to a dying industry town. it doesn't make the statement less true.
Telling them their dignity does not depend on this record borders on outright condescension. When the advisor simultaneously declines to aggressively optimize their materials to beat the bias they are facing. In an effort to avoid manipulating the labor market, the LPR method asks the most vulnerable job seekers to absorb all the friction.
That is a remarkably harsh reading of a boundary that is literally designed to protect them.
When the advisor aggressively refuses to take any responsibility for the outcome, saying, "I don't guarantee jobs, I just guarantee a governed record," it forces us to look at the certification structure itself. Is the CLPRA certification actually about protecting the client, or is it a sophisticated way for the JPCLPR platform to capture value while shielding itself from market risk?
That's quite a claim.
Think about it. The platform charges $1,000 for the credential, but they mandate that the credentialed professional can never, ever promise a result.
Because promising a result you can't control is fraud.
But look at the asymmetry. If the client fails to get a job, the advisor says, "Well, it's a broken market. I told you I couldn't guarantee anything." If the client somehow gets caught lying, the advisor says, "Well, the doctrine says the client owns the source layer, so they must have lied to me." The advisor and the platform take on absolutely zero risk, while the desperate client pays the fee and absorbs all the market friction.
You are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of professional certification.
Am I?
Yes, the separation of the CLPRA certification from guaranteed job placement is exactly what ensures the method's integrity. It is the proof that this isn't some predatory pyramid scheme. Think about a structural engineer.
Back to the building metaphors?
Bear with me. If a structural engineer charges you to certify that a commercial building is up to code, they don't guarantee that you are going to find tenants to rent the offices. They guarantee the structural integrity of the building. The LPR advisor is doing the exact same thing for the professional record.
The flaw in that analogy is that a structural engineer is operating in a physical reality bound by the laws of physics and municipal codes. The job seeker is operating in an opaque, adversarial system run by arbitrary AI filters and exhausted, overworked recruiters. The rules of physics don't change daily. Applicant tracking algorithms do.
Which is precisely why promising to get them a job is selling a lie. If an advisor promises to get a client past the ATS, they are claiming authority over an algorithmic ranking system they do not own, they did not build, and they cannot see.
But they know how it works.
The anti-drift rules, the mandate to pause, refer, or decline, are designed to stop advisors from becoming snake oil salespeople. When a client says, "Guarantee me an interview," and the advisor declines, they are protecting that client from predatory coaching practices that drain bank accounts based on fabricated hope. The restraint is the service.
I just don't buy that it's that simple.
Refusing to guarantee an outcome forces both the client and the advisor to focus entirely on what they actually have the power to govern: the evidence, the context, the privacy labeling, and the accurate rendering of claims.
I understand the mechanism, I really do, but by focusing exclusively on what can be strictly governed, you artificially limit the advisor's ability to advocate for the human being sitting in front of them.
Advocacy doesn't mean breaking the rules.
Let's go back to the exact mandate to decline. It tells the advisor to decline when a client asks for work outside scope that cannot be safely reframed. It also strictly prohibits giving HR compliance advice, tax advice, or recruiting advice unless you are separately qualified.
Yes, because practicing outside your scope is dangerous.
But the line between translating a market lane, which is allowed, and giving recruiting advice, which is prohibited, is razor thin in the real world. If an advisor is terrified of breaching their scope, if they are constantly worried they might accidentally drift into giving recruiting advice, they will inevitably default to doing less for the client.
That's a behavioral assumption.
The pause, refer, decline framework creates a culture of professional timidity. The advisor becomes a historian. They become a referee of the client's past rather than an aggressive advocate for the client's future.
Referee of a client's past is, well, it's an interesting way to put it. But I argue that verified past evidence is the only ethical and practical foundation for any future claims. The advisor isn't being timid. They are holding the line. They are maintaining the boundary that prevents this entire methodology from devolving into surveillance.
Wait, how does aggressive advocacy equal surveillance?
Because if the advisor starts over-optimizing, pushing boundaries, and demanding more and more granular data from the client just to beat the system, they drift from privacy into exposure. They start treating the living professional record as an employer dossier. They start treating it like a universal employability score, where the goal is just to maximize the number to please a machine.
I see what you're saying, but
The moment the advisor takes ownership of the client's narrative to force a market outcome, the client becomes subservient to the record. The curriculum explicitly warns against this outcome. It says, the record serves the worker does not serve the record. By strictly utilizing the levers to pause, refer, or decline, the advisor ensures the worker retains total ownership and control over their own professional truth.
well, on that specific principle, we actually have total convergence. I absolutely agree that the worker must not serve the record. Where we fundamentally diverge is how that principle operates under immense economic duress.
Right.
You look at the rigid application of pause, refer, or decline, and you see a shield. You see a mechanism that protects the client's truth from being manipulated by a broken market. I look at it, and I see a rigid methodology that can very easily be weaponized to dismiss the messy, panicked suffering of job seekers.
I wouldn't say weaponized.
When someone is drowning in silence fatigue and algorithmic rejection, telling them, I must decline this unsafe optimization because I don't own your truth, might be procedurally flawless, according to Module 9. But humanly, it feels like methodological abandonment. It feels like we care more about the purity of the rulebook than the survival of the person in the room.
And I summarize my stance by anchoring right back to that rulebook, because the rulebook is what keeps the professional honest. The advisor protects the method by protecting the client's source layer. Restraint is not a limitation. Restraint is the very essence of the service we are providing.
Even if it hurts them in the short term.
Knowing exactly when to pause because AI use is unclear, when to refer out because the client needs genuine therapeutic support, and when to decline because the client wants to fabricate their history, that is the ultimate expression of professional judgment. It is the only way to ensure that a worker's authentic history, their privacy, and their dignity are never manipulated, exposed, or sold out for the sake of short-term market hype. Yes, the hiring market is deeply broken, but we do not fix a broken market by compromising the truth of the people forced to navigate it.
It is a profound tension, and I think it's one that every single advisor is going to struggle with on a daily basis. We both agree that the client owns the source layer, and that an advisor should never invent a surface claim without underlying source evidence. The core disagreement remains on the flexibility of that boundary in the real world.
Exactly.
I just worry deeply that an overly rigid adherence to these rules risks intellectualizing a crisis. It forces clients to navigate dense orientation frameworks when what they desperately need is immediate, practical leverage to pay their bills.
The balance between maintaining systemic, methodological boundaries and providing human compassion is incredibly complex. It is a tension that requires deep, continued engagement with the full LPR Academy curriculum to really fully unpack. Which, honestly, brings us right back to where we started. When you step into the world of human careers and automated hiring systems, the diagnostic machinery is broken. The picture is never clean.
No, it's not. The waters will always be muddy.
But perhaps the strict boundaries of pause, refer, decline aren't there to magically fix the machine or to clear the water. Perhaps they are simply there to ensure that in the dark, murky reality of the labor market, we aren't the ones adding to the damage.
That is the ultimate question every advisor will have to answer for themselves the moment a panicked client sits across from them.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this discourse. Until next time.